Welcome back to Heart of Poland. This is part 2 in a special 2-part series on the invasion of Poland in September 1939 with British historian Roger Moorhouse, who's just released a book on that campaign, and we're filming this at the extraordinary Museum of the Second World War in Gdansk, Poland. In this episode, Roger talks about some of the myths that surround the campaign and the terrible massacres that were inflicted on Polish civilians and soldiers during that brutal month of September 1939. Roger, thank you for joining us for episode 2, and we've relocated to a war-torn Warsaw later in the war at the Museum of the Second World War in Gdansk. We're going to talk in this episode about this brutal battle in September, which is so little understood. And remember, if you haven't watched episode 1, you should do that now before you get to this episode. It's available on the First News wherever you find it. We talked a little bit about how the battle kind of breaks out this point at Westerplatte, this attack, Yellin as well. Can you just take us through these early stages of the battle? What does it look like? Is this a gentlemanly, chivalrous war?
Oh, most certainly not. I think it's worth mentioning that, again, to counter this prevalent view that the Poles were, incompetent in 39, for want of a better word. First of all, there are a number of engagements in those opening days where the Poles actually acquit themselves rather well against the Germans, bearing in mind that they are, as we said, outgunned, lacking the technology that the Germans have, lacking the sheer numbers of tanks and aircraft that the Germans have. But there are a number of engagements where the Poles actually particularly use the terrain very well, and they're able to defend themselves quite effectively. So there's a couple of sites, for example, like Węgierska Górka down in the south, where they have a sort of network of bunkers in a valley, and they actually hold out, very well against the initial German attack, and give the Germans a bloody nose. And the same thing at the Battle of Mokra down on the southwestern front, or, close to the Silesian frontier, where again a Polish cavalry brigade holds back, the German panzers for a day before withdrawing in reasonably good order. I mean, this is a remarkable engagement in every way, and I think it shows you how effective the Polish cavalry could be. This isn't cavalrymen charging tanks with lances. This is the image that the Germans and almost everyone else has repeated ever since. But Polish cavalry fights dismounted. It has artillery. It has anti-tank rifles, which are very effective. This Uruguay. So in a number of instances, they could fight remarkably well, and they do at places like Mokra. Also at Mława in the north of Modlin. They have they've built extensive defences which hold the Germans, frustrate the German attack for a couple of days. So in some places they actually fight very, very well.
And in the book, you describe kind of the reaction of some of the German military. They seem to be quite surprised by the level of resistance. Is it fair to say that the Germans were expecting a much easier war in these early stages? I
think it's mixed, actually, because I think elsewhere, if you look, for example, at the fighting in the Polish corridor, what historically we call the Polish corridor, that's a relatively easier advance for the Germans. So that would probably have conformed to their expectations. But certainly where they're given a bloody nose, certainly amongst the ordinary German soldier experiencing that, it's almost like, well, this isn't how we were told it was going to be. That they're actually, their tanks are being destroyed by Polish anti-tank rifles, for example. So it's very mixed. It depends where you are. But where they're given a bloody nose, the Germans really do experience a bloody nose.
Now, the world is shocked at the speed of the advance, and this Blitzkrieg, is a Blitzkrieg myth, or is it Blitzkrieg reality? Was it being made up as it went along?
That's one of the sort of crucial points, I suppose, coming out of the book is... This is another of the myths, fundamentally, is that the German narrative was that our troops and our military doctrine that they went in with was so superior that the enemy was nowhere to be seen, was destroyed on the ground, and all of that stuff. It's a very swift, easy victory. You can't dismiss that entirely because it was relatively straightforward victory for the Germans. But to simply attribute that to the Blitzkrieg is rather buying too much into the German propaganda, because there's a lot more going on. There are failings on the part of the Poles, for one thing. The Poles have this culture of military secrecy, for example, which is a throwback to Pilsudski's time, where neighbouring units at the front had to communicate with each other via the high command. And you can see the fundamental problem with that in a combat situation. That communications can be down, the radio can be down, the high command can be withdrawing as it did on the 6th of September, thereby throwing communications between the armies up in the air. So I mean, there's all sorts of problems with that scenario, that they can't talk to one another and ascertain what their respective duties and goals are. That's a fundamental failing in any combat situation, and that's one that the Poles suffered from. So that contributes to their weak performance, comparatively weak performance. Also the weather. I mean, the weather conspires against the Poles. If they were intending, as they were, ultimately to try and use, Poland's rivers, Poland's great rivers, the Narew, the Bug, and the Vistula, as some sort of, last line of defence, they're frustrated because, certainly the Narew and the Bug are at historically low levels. It was a very dry summer in 1939. So they're frustrated in that respect that they can't use those natural obstacles. So that's another aspect that plays into it. But so just to attribute the Polish defeat and by extension the German victory to Blitzkrieg is rather to read history backwards and rather buying into German propaganda. Blitzkrieg itself is still a military doctrine that's in the process of developing in 1939. So some units are using it very effectively, most notably Guderian, who's kind of the father of the idea.
And there's this wonderful moment, sorry Roger, in the book where you describe, I think he goes up to one of his commanders and says, show me your map. And the commander has his map folded the distance of an average day's march. And Guderian, sorry, he says, no, unfolds your entire map and points to
that's where I want you to go.
100 kilometres further or something. He says, you need to be there tonight. And this is this.
It's a perfect example of Blitzkrieg mentality, which is to send these armored spearheads as far and as fast as you can go. Don't bother about what you pass on the way. Don't fight anyone unless they're right in front of you. Just go and take whatever it is, that strategic town, that strategic bridge, whatever it might be. In that case, it was a bridge. And in a sense, the mentality is that that not only achieves the objective, which is to take whatever the objective was, in that case a bridge, but it also disrupts the idea of any sort of coherent front, that the opponent doesn't know where you are. There's another scene in the book which is from the British journalist Claire Hollingworth, who was down in the south, ended up in Krakow for a while, and then Krakow fell and she was evacuated east. And she talks about driving through the Polish countryside and asking a Polish peasant, saying, have the Germans come past here? And he says, what Germans? And she says, the Germans in the tanks. And he goes, oh yeah, the tanks have been. But he hasn't seen any troops, so he doesn't think the Germans have been, but the tanks have already been through. And it's another sort of perfect example of how Blitzkrieg worked. It was just sort of disrupting any sort of any method of trying to effect some sort of phased defence is thrown out the window because you actually don't know where the enemy are.
So these strong points, these bunker complexes that are still holding out, they're quickly enveloped.
That's the problem. Yeah, that's the problem. That places like Mława, where they do hold out very effectively because they're utilising terrain and they're utilising the defences that they've already built. But the great fear is that they will get surrounded and they'll be attacked from the rear. So that's why they do eventually pull back. And the problem the Poles have is always, because it's not really a motorised army. So the problem they always have is that they, with the best will in the world, however hard they fight, they can't withdraw fast enough because they are always going to be in a foot race against the Germans.
It's also, of course, a battle in the air as well. What are the comparative numerical forces here? How many Polish planes going up against how many German?
The German forces are something like 2,500. combat aircraft. And of course that's bombers and fighters. The bombers are already, bombing the big cities already on day one. They are doing so very effectively. The Poles have a small number of up-to-date bombers. The Wash bomber, which was very effective, used in a couple of instances quite effectively, but not enough of them really to be effective. So you're left with these rather more primitive, P7, P11 fighters up against the German aircraft, which were faster, better armed, and the Polish pilots acquitted themselves very well in the circumstances. And as I said, we said before, there is a persistent myth that the Polish Air Force is destroyed on day one. It's not. But they still are, very much up against it and fighting against the odds.
Now, it comes through strongly in the book that the German Air Force is used, of course, as a weapon of terror. We talked about this in episode 1, but can you just outline for us what this actually meant for those on the ground?
A very good example is, as we've mentioned before, the bombing of Yellin, which was on day one of the campaign. I think one question that's worth clearing up. It is still disputed, but I think even the timing of the bombing of Yellin is one of those things that is still controversial. According to Wehrmacht records, it is about 5:40 in the morning, and it's often assumed to have been an hour earlier than that, which sort of predates the attack on Westerplatte, for example. So there's been a sort of almost a guerrilla campaign to try and make Yellin the first engagement of the war, which I don't think is correct, but that's an argument for another day. But Yellin is not far from the then Polish-German border, on the sort of the north border of Silesia, and it's a relatively small town. Doesn't have any defences, doesn't have any air defences. According to German military intelligence, a Polish cavalry unit had been there the day before, but that could be window dressing, we don't know. But anyway, it's unarmed. It doesn't have any military presence on the 1st of September. And is bombed by the Stukas of the Luftwaffe, which is a remarkably effective weapon in 1939, the Stuka, the Ju-87. Effectively, it's like aerial artillery. Aerial bombing was a very imprecise art. Actually, it was a very imprecise art even in 1945. I think we project back with what we can do nowadays in terms of technology and how accurate we can be in 2019, we project that back to imagining we could do the same thing during World War II, and we really couldn't. Certainly can't do it in 1939. So conventional aerial bombing is a completely blunt weapon. It's area bombing rather than anything of any precision at all. The only thing that you can use with any precision is actually a Stuka, which could target an individual bridge or even an individual building. Because of the dive, it could give itself the right trajectory and drop a bomb on a target. So Stukas and other Luftwaffe aircraft bomb Yellin on day one with devastating effect. Yellin is destroyed to about 80% on day one. And there's another example later on in the war of a place called Frampol, which was another undefended Polish town, which was bombed to destruction by the Wehrmacht. Again, it had no military presence. And the question is, why was Frampol destroyed? And the only sort of logical answer you can think of is that it was one of these old sort of foundations that was built on a strict grid pattern, with the Ratusz, the town hall, being right in the centre of the town, and everything else on a grid around it. So it's almost like bombing a target. You could actually see how close you got to the centre of the target.
So, I mean, I perhaps mistakenly now I realise I had this impression of the Wehrmacht, especially in these early months when it's also clean and neat, this Blitzkrieg, ultra-professional, this German army corps, kind of, still relatively morally uncorrupt, but as you make out so clearly in the book, this is absolutely not the case. They're murdering civilians, bombing Vienna and other places, strafing refugee columns, carrying out mass executions on a scale that's quite difficult to comprehend.
It is, and I make the point in the book. I think this is race war. I think that's the only phrase you can use for it. It's interesting that when we look at World War II as a whole in Europe, I think there's an assumption that there's a sort of an acceleration, a galloping barbarism that develops through the war, almost as a side effect of the war. And we know certainly that, as the war gets to its end point, it certainly does get, increasingly brutalized. And of course, you've got the Holocaust beginning in 1941, and you've got, the invasion of the Soviet Union is unbelievably brutal. But I think we assume almost that the early phase is somehow vaguely chivalrous or unbrutal, and I think that's very much our Western perception, because the French campaign in 1940 was relatively, again I stress relatively, chivalrous in the way it was conducted. There weren't that many massacres. There are, I think, 2 massacres of British POWs carried out by the SS, Wormhout and Paradis. There are a number of other massacres, particularly of French colonial troops, done by the SS. But again, you've got a total of maybe 20 or so massacres. I know that they're dreadful in themselves, but if you compare that to what was happening 6 months before in Poland, that's almost a day in Poland. If you look at the statistics, there are over 600 massacres in the September campaign by the Germans alone. And I think the only explanation that really holds water is that this is fundamentally a race war. That the ordinary German soldiers and their commanders are going into that campaign with the view that the Poles are essentially expendable. You don't have to treat them decently. You don't have to take care of POWs. They don't count. They're fundamentally not worthy of your attention. And that, to me, is the only plausible explanation, because it doesn't happen in the French campaign. So it's a different attitude that has been engaged in that war in the East than is engaged in the war in the West. So you have numerous instances where, and they're various, almost any reasoning or any excuse can suffice to trigger a massacre. There are, the most ridiculous examples. There's a massacre at a place called Kajetanowice, which is a village where I think 70 Poles in this village are massacred because 2 Wehrmacht horses are killed, which is is ridiculous. It's an absolutely ridiculous act of horrific revenge for the death of a couple of horses. And this is kind of reflected right across the canvas of September 39. It's happening almost in every town and every village. So there are spectacular ones, Sunday, Bloody Sunday at Bude Cottage, for example, the Bromberg. And almost every village is seeing the same example.
What happens on
that? Was essentially, the Poles, it's an old Germanic foundation, long time ago. It still had a large German population within Bromberg. It's in the Polish corridor. And in the opening days of the war, as the Poles are withdrawing through Bromberg, they're attacked by ethnic Germans. And they retaliate, and they round up those that have attacked them, and many of them are executed. In revenge for that, when the Germans get to Bromberg, they round up anyone they can find, railwomen, scouts, all of the sort of Polish populations, anyone that falls into their hands, and they avenge themselves effectively, times 10. So they carry out sort of a 3-day massacre, and it's very systematically done in a way, perhaps that the Polish suppression of that uprising initially was not quite so systematic. So this is where one of the first instances where the Einsatzgruppen are brought into operation is in Bude Cottage, which is a very systematic sort of combing through of the territory, combing through of the suburbs where they believed that these, the Polish bandits, as they put it, were present, combing through, rounding up people, taking them out, shooting them. So this is really much more the behaviour that we see after 1941 in the Soviet Union, but we're already seeing it in 1939, which might surprise some readers.
So if you're a civilian fleeing, you're fleeing quite literally from the possibility you're going to be bayoneted,
absolutely,
murdered, set on fire in a barn, all these things that we kind of associate with the later years of
absolutely.
the war.
That's all happening in 1939, which I probably shouldn't have been as surprised by that as I was, but I did find that surprising.
Indeed, that's my next question, because it must have been quite shocking to come across all these
when
accounts.
you read the scale of this and how prevalent it is, that this is happening almost in every village, and I sort of I almost to bring that across, I sort of list the figures. 75 people here, 60 people here, 52 people here, and it's just to make the point that this is happening everywhere. I describe it as a race war. That's what I think it is.
And then you've also got this incredible kind of stubbornness, this obstinate Polish resistance. There's a scene in the book where you describe a gentleman, I think he's being murdered in front of his children. He's thrown into a pit having been shot, and he shouts out, "You can kill us all, but Poland will survive." And then they club him to death with spades. It's ghastly, horrible scene, but it says volumes about the kind of fight that the Poles bring to this battle.
Yes, it's horrific stuff, and I always, when I write these or find that material and try and write those scenes, I often find myself actually toning it down because it's very often it is so horrific. But you also want to bring across that human element, because that does bring it home to the reader, and that's what you want to do. You want to get an emotional reaction at some point. That's not to just be completely emotive all the time, but I think it can be sort of almost tactically used as a writer to bring across a human aspect to the story.
Now, Roger, we're in this room at the Museum of the Second World War in Gdansk, and it shows Warsaw burnt out and destroyed at the end of the Second World War, so it's talking about the Warsaw Uprising. But I brought you here very deliberately because, apart from this T-34 tank, this walls and this would have been what a lot of Warsaw looked like halfway through the September campaign, so midway through September.
Yeah.
You outline in the book about the horrendous bombing that's carried out, not just on many different cities, but on the capital of Poland, which is so easily reachable from the German. What did it look like? How much of Warsaw is destroyed?
Yes, Warsaw. The Germans reach Warsaw actually relatively early in the campaign. The German spearheads from that Silesian front first reach Warsaw already on, I think, the 9th of September, so very early on. They're met at the outskirts of the city and are held back, and then subsequently a lot of those spearheads are subsequently withdrawn to combat the Bzura offensive, which is to the west of Warsaw, across the river Bzura, which is the largest sort of set-piece battle, as it were, of the September campaign. So in that sense, the campaign against Warsaw kind of is halted to deal with Bzura first of all. But then later on, the capital is surrounded and effectively put under siege. Initially, including the area of Modlin to the north, and then later on Modlin falls, obviously. But the very worst of that actually is much later. It is suffering urban warfare and aerial bombing right from those early days and months, or days and weeks. But the very worst actually is the aerial campaign around the 25th of September, which is when Hitler basically said that he wanted Warsaw to fall and he wanted it now. And artillery was to open up, the Luftwaffe was to give it everything that they had to force a solution, to force a surrender of Warsaw. And on that day, the tonnage that's dropped on Warsaw is horrific. It's the highest tonnage dropped, in the first sort of year or so of the war. It certainly outstrips bombing of Coventry, the bombing of Rotterdam in 1940, both in 1940. Outstrips both of those in terms of tonnage. So the destruction again, and it's also aimed at largely civilian targets. As you said, this is a besieged city. There is a front line. There's a definable front line, but they're bombing the centre of the city. They're bombing the civilian inhabited areas very deliberately. So this is, as a Polish commentator at the time said, this is the Germans trying to take the city by terror, and it was horrific. So you have bread lines, being strafed by German fighters and so on.
Yeah, and there's a scene I think in the book where the women standing in the bread line refuse to move because if they get out, they won't get any food for their family.
It was a wonderfully evocative passage from a memoir that I found of people queuing up for bread early in the morning, and then the bread line attracting the attentions of a Luftwaffe fighter who comes down the line of the road and strafes the road. And a number of people are killed, and the bread line just moves to one side and stays in place. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Again, it's so cinematic. It would make an amazing scene in a film, I imagine.
And that brings me neatly on to the story, I think it's the American photographer whose name escapes
Julian
me.
Bryan.
Exactly, who, when every other foreigner is leaving Warsaw as quickly as they can get their head out because of the conditions there, he goes in and takes some of the most evocative photos of World War II.
The most iconic images, really. I mean, you see, I'm sure some of our viewers will have seen his images and not really known where they've come from. But, he was there. And was actually more or less given carte blanche by the Warsaw's mayor Starzyński to essentially to document what Warsaw was experiencing. He wanted to get the message out to the outside world that this was what was happening, and he used Julian Bryan to do that. So he gave him a car, he gave him a minder, gave him a pass to go wherever he needed to go, and he went and told the story. And Julian Bryan actually did that very, very well. And when he did finally get out, he was evacuated with other, the last remaining foreign nationals. And he did go back to America, made a very good documentary film about Warsaw's, the Siege of Warsaw in '39. So he was true to his word. But some of that photography is remarkable. That famous picture of, the young Kazimierza Mika with, bending over the dead body of her sister. Absolutely iconic, and I'm sure a lot of our viewers will know the image very well.
Now let's move on to obviously what happens when Hitler and Stalin sign a pact, which is that Russian troops invade the east of Poland, effectively pulling the rug from under the Polish army's feet. Yeah.
Now the Polish army had the sort of emergency plan, if you like, the contingency plan. Was to try and conduct a fighting withdrawal to the southeast, to the Romanian frontier, which was the only sort of friendly frontier that they had, effectively, even though it wasn't that friendly. But they tried to achieve that. So you've got various, government bodies. You've got various, the Enigma scientists, for example, are all heading to the southeast and get out that way. So lots of people are trying to get out to the southeast. And that is effectively hamstrung by the Soviet invasion, which begins at dawn on the 17th of September. And the Soviets invade, and it's, again, there's more mythology here as well, because the Soviet mythology, which has been sort of readily swallowed down the line, down the years, is that they weren't there at all, or that their Red Army incursion on the 17th of September was in some way a sort of humanitarian policing operation. It was nothing of the sort. It's a full-out military invasion. So you have two fronts. You have about 500,000 soldiers. You have thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft. It's a full military invasion without question. And you can see that in the contemporary documents. There's no question that this is a military operation. Facing them is predominantly the Polish Border Guards Corps, which has no armour, has very little in the way of artillery and anything beyond normal infantry weaponry. Essentially, they have been sort of policing that sort of rather wild, long eastern frontier since the 1920s. They're equipped for perhaps border smuggling operations and limited military endeavours, but certainly not a full-scale Red Army invasion. They do resist very manfully in a number of instances, but in many instances they withdraw as best they can. So the resistance against it is limited, purely because the Poles can't resist effectively.
Presumably morale just completely falls apart, because it's one thing to fight Nazi Germany, but it's quite another to know that behind you are coming the Red Army.
Yes, and there are, I mentioned this in the book as well, there are a number of instances where Poles, there are a number of instances of suicides, for example, when news of the Soviet invasion arrives, that they say, well, that's it, we're back to 1795, it's another partition of Poland. I mean, that was a hammer blow to a lot of Poles, I think, when news of the Soviet invasion came.
And yet there's still confusion because the Soviets are duplicitous as ever, and they're saying, well, actually, we're coming to help you. And in some cases, there's the sense that they're so confused about why they're there that they think they're possibly fighting Germany, or the average soldier might say so.
It's interesting. The propaganda narrative that they give themselves is one often that they're coming to aid the Poles against the Germans. And that's given, again, you say, absolutely duplicitously to the Polish people. They drop leaflets saying, we're coming to help you. So you can see there's this deliberate sowing of disinformation. It sounds very much like our modern day fake news and so on. Deliberate sowing of disinformation to hamstring any sort of defence operation. So in many cases, the Red Army vanguards are met by Polish garrisons, and they say, oh, welcome, when are we going to fight the Germans? And they say, right, okay, hands up, that's it, your war's over. So it's a very sort of nasty, duplicitous, mendacious little war.
There's a moment which brought chill to me, where you say that in one zone occupied by one army, if you had soft hands, and you remember not a member of the working class, a member of the bourgeoisie, that was practically a death sentence. And then in another zone, if you were circumcised, then that would be the next death sentence.
I mean, you do, as I've said, I think in the German occupied zone, or in the area under fighting the Germans, you have a race war going on effectively. And in the eastern occupied zone after the 17th of September, you have class war. So one thing they do import with them is, in the baggage train of the Red Army is full-blown communism. Is coming with you. So anyone that's officer class, intelligentsia, anyone that fits those categories is separated out from the ordinary soldiers and sent to an unknown fate. Many of those officers are those that end up, in the Katyn massacres, for example, of 1940. And again, I mean, as a way of countering the sort of the measure by which ordinary Polish soldiers would sort of tear off any of their insignia so that they can't be identified as perhaps as officers or whatever. Then they started to look at the hands of their prisoners, and this idea of bieloruczki, so those with white hands, as you mentioned, and they would check your hands. If you weren't a horny-handed son of toil, a peasant with calloused hands, then you were clearly an intellectual and a member of the bourgeoisie, and you'd be separated out for further interrogation. So it's very, very obviously class war.
Another thing which surprised me, which you have in the book, is there's a level of military cooperation between the Soviets and the Nazis, but there are also clashes at the same time. They actually actively fight each other.
It is quite a confused picture, actually, that whole question of collaboration between the two. It would make a wonderful PhD for somebody to look at that particular aspect, if you can get access to the archives. Generally, the two tried to keep away from each other. And the key point there is that Stalin valued the political utility of his neutrality in World War II far too highly to allow that to be compromised by the narrative to get out that he's collaborating openly with Hitler. So this is why they paint it as a humanitarian policing operation. It's not a military operation in the Soviet narrative at all. So he's very keen to maintain that sort of fiction of neutrality, which means you keep a distance from the Germans. So supposedly they was to keep a 25-kilometre distance between their units. Now that worked in many cases, and in many cases it didn't. One of the main problems was that the Germans, down to the sort of the exigencies of war and the unpredictability of war, the Germans overstepped the original demarcation line that had been agreed in the secret protocol on the 23rd of April, pushed further east, which meant they took territory that had to then be ceded to the Red Army. And that happens, for example, at Brześć, Brest-Litovsk, on the Bug, where Guderian actually takes the city and then is met by his Red Army counterpart, a brigadier called Semyon Krivoshin, and he has to cede the city to the Soviets, which is done in a relatively straightforward manner, but they do mark the occasion with a military parade, which is one of the few examples where there's a joint German-Soviet military parade in 1939, and it's captured for the newsreels. There are photographs of it, it's a very disquieting image for those of us that have grown up with the idea of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union being the implacable foes of World War II. To see the two of them parading together in Brest-Litovsk in 1939 is one of those moments where you go, hang on, what's going on here? And it sort of provokes all sorts of questions. And the images are iconic. They also collaborate less effectively in the Siege of Lvov in September 39, where the two actually come to blows in a brief engagement just outside Lvov. And in many cases, I think the reason for that is not only that lack of clarity in terms of the mission, particularly from the Soviet side. Soviet soldiers didn't know why they were invading Poland. They'd been told all sorts of things. Their own propaganda narrative that was sold to the Poles, which was that they were coming to aid them against the Germans. They thought, well, is that right? That sort of fits with pre-war politics and the pre-war policy. So they're in the dark. Many Soviet soldiers are rather in the dark. And it's very difficult to shift that mentality. These are two regimes that have almost defined themselves in the previous 6 years, certainly in the German case, defined themselves as being the opposite of the other, the righteous opposite of the other. So to then turn around and say, well, we're now in cahoots and we're all working together against the common enemy, it was simply too difficult for a lot of ordinary soldiers to take on board. So I think there is some difficult messaging to get across in that sense, and it results in a number of instances of conflict.
As well as, I think, with Lvov, Hitler agreed to take the credit for capturing the city, didn't he? So that the Russians didn't have to admit that they were taking part in the battle.
Well,
there's a moment in the book, I think.
The difficult situation in Lvov was that the commandant of the Polish commander of Lvov, the Lvov garrison, made the decision to hand the city over to the Soviets, thinking that was he didn't want to hand over the city to the Germans who had been besieging it. So in a sense, I think it's often portrayed that he was in some way duped, that he fell for this narrative that the Soviets were coming to aid him. I don't think that's the case. If you look at his diary, which I was reading in the archive, that message doesn't come across. And what does come across is that he is not willing, on a point of principle, to hand over the city to the Germans because they are the ones that he's been fighting. So he is more willing to hand it over to the Soviets.
Roger, we've done a huge amount of myth busting. Had there been any myths on the Polish side that you've perhaps looked at and said, hang on, this isn't quite right?
I think there are a couple. I mean, they're much smaller scale, certainly, than the German and the Soviet mythology. I think there's a couple of sort of minor stories that come up. I think other people have had a go at them as well. I'm perhaps doing it in a more public manner. I think the story of the parachute tower in Katowice is one that's a little bit dubious. The idea that sort of scouts held out for any length of time against the German invasion there. I mean, yes, it looks like something similar to the myth happened, but it's just the question of the duration and the numbers involved and that sort of thing. So that's one that perhaps needs to be adjusted downwards. And I think the same thing with the Battle of Wisna, for example, which is quite an iconic moment. And this isn't to deny that it happened or to deny the heroism of the captain involved, Captain Raginis, at Wisna, but this sort of narrative that has almost extrapolated from the engagement of Wisna, and to say that essentially a couple of or a handful of Polish bunkers held out against 40,000 German soldiers is rather exaggerated, and I think that's one that probably needs to be revised a little bit. So there's a few things there, but there's nothing really on the same scale, I think, as the headline stuff that the German narrative of Blitzkrieg and the German narrative of cavalry against tanks versus the Soviet mythology that they weren't there at all. Those are much more important myths to be busted than sort of tweaking some of the mild exaggerations on the Polish side.
So how does the war end for Poland and Polish soldiers invaded from both sides, the misinformation, the chaos?
Polish resistance is, by the sort of last couple of weeks of the war, effectively, is confined to Warsaw and Modlin initially, and also the Hel Peninsula up in the far north in the Baltic. And beyond that, you have a sort of to some extent a closing gap between the two forces. You've got the Soviets coming in, the Germans pushing westwards, pushing up to their line of demarcation, and within that, or between that, you've got forces trying to move south, who engage one or other, in some cases both forces, to escape through Romania. And that is eventually, you've got almost a wild east going on with sort of shattered Polish forces, amalgamations of various units, sort of border guards versus, or amalgamated with regular military, with, people like the Pinsk Riverine Flotilla, for example. Their soldiers were incorporated into one of these units. And this is actually the last one that fights. Actually, I should probably wind back, but Modlin, which is the fortress north of, the old fortress north of Warsaw, falls on the 28th of September, surrenders on the 28th of September. Warsaw is surrendered the following day because, essentially that's, the ring around the city has become that tight that they didn't want to essentially be fighting for every street. So it made sense to surrender Warsaw. Hel surrenders on the 2nd of October, and that's the last of those sort of enclaves. And then you're left with these forces who are essentially wandering and stuck between two hostile armies. And the greatest example of that is the Polessia Independent Operational Group under Franciszek Kleberg, which is moving west from Polessia, from the area around and to the east of Brest. And they've been moving west, trying to avoid the Soviets. Originally, they were heading for Warsaw, thinking that they could bolster the defense of Warsaw in some way. And it is rather a sort of a ragtag caravan, but it still has military discipline. It still has units that are intact. So it is still a fighting force as well. It has with it also a large extended caravan of civilians. So it's very much a mixture of military and civilian as well. But that's moving westwards. They then hear that Warsaw has fallen, and they start to try to move to the southeast, southwest, down towards the Holy Cross Mountains, thinking that might be a way that they could continue the fight against the Germans. And they are finally engaged by the Germans at Kotsk, which is just to the east of the Vistula, south of Warsaw. And again, it's the final engagement of the war. Battle of Kotsk is a 3-day engagement with Kleberg's forces against the Germans. And they acquit themselves well. But the reality is that no one else is fighting. The rest of the country has fallen. And on the 5th of October, surrender of Kleberg's forces is negotiated, which is then carried out on the 6th of October, and that is the end of the September campaign.
If you compare the invasion of Poland to the invasion of the Low Countries and France, is there any similarities, or perhaps can you see a difference there in terms of the fighting quality of the Poles versus the French, let's say?
It's a very good question. If you look at the technological advantages that the French had, if you look at all of the advantages actually that the British and the French had in 1940, the problem they had that let them down is a will to fight. They didn't have the political will to fight. There are other aspects. They're not using the tanks that they have, for example, in the same way as the Germans are. This idea of Blitzkrieg and sort of punching through, that their tank doctrine is rather more primitive than the German one. So there are other aspects that play into it. But actually, man for man, I think the Poles do better than the British and the French do in 1940. There's certainly a will to fight. There's a will to defend the country, and where you have fortifications, where you have terrain that can be utilised, they actually fight very, very effectively. And this was recognised by German troops as well. So there's a number of instances where German commanders say that actually, these Poles are fighting very, very effectively and very well. For all their shortcomings in terms of technology and equipment and everything else, man for man, they fought very, very effectively.
Writing a book is an exhausting process. It must feel quite rewarding to have finished writing this book. What kind of reaction have you had so far? Because the Polish language version is out. The English language version is on the 5th of September.
Yeah.
It's the 80th anniversary. It seems like a very good time to release a book of this kind.
It is. Shamelessly, I pitched it, when I proposed the book to chime with the anniversary. But I did the same thing with the Devil's Alliance. That came out for the 75th anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and it's useful to try and hang it on an anniversary. It doesn't always work. So sometimes there'll be no recognition from the media, but occasionally it might give a hook, and you might generate some interest because of the anniversary. I think in this case it seems to be working quite well. Certainly in Poland there's lots of interest around the 80th anniversary of these events, so that seems to be certainly having a positive effect. I think so far, what I've heard has been very positive. There's been a few sort of whispers in Britain of reviewers who have got back to me and have said how much they enjoyed the book and so on. So that's all been very positive. I am a historian predominantly of sort of political, a little bit of social history. I'm not really a military historian. So it's not like this is a sort of a military, one of those sort of pure military texts where it tells you that the 3rd Battalion of the 75th Regiment advanced 3 kilometres to the line of the river, whatever it is, because I find that stuff makes my eyes bleed. I can't, I don't enjoy it, and I didn't want to write that book. I wanted to write a book that sort of told the political and the human and the social history around this conflict. So obviously it has to have some of the military material in there, but I'd like to think it's a bigger book than that. It's not a purely military history.
Well, the closest writer I can find when I think about this kind of book would be Anthony Beevor, and I couldn't pay a higher compliment. It reads extremely well, and I highly recommend it. Roger, thank you very much for taking us through this brief but illustrative tour of the September campaign. So you can find Roger's book. It's called First to Fight, the Polish War 1939, with this iconic cover, and it's also out in Polish language, Polska 1939. If you haven't watched episode 1 from this special 2-part series, then make sure you do. We talk a lot, we bust quite a number of myths in that episode, as we have done in this one. And do make sure, of course, that you look for more of the fascinating discussions that we've had with historians, artists, writers, poets, and all manner of other people about the fascinating country of Poland. This has been probably one of the greatest privileges I've had as the presenter of Heart of Poland, to sit with Roger and talk about this campaign. So I wish you and the book the very best, and I think I can thank you on behalf of Poland for having been the person who's written the first English language book on the September campaign, which means so much to Poland. So do share this episode wherever you find it with anyone who you think might be interested in it. Check out the other interviews we've had with Roger, and make sure you, of course, check out the first news. I'll see you again for the next episode of Heart of Poland.